We now turn to thinking about specific missionary work done in the early Middle Ages. I want to highlight some things. Again, we're not covering everything. There are probably some other people that we can mention and other efforts. But one thing to remember is that as part of this period, some of that early work being done was Arian in nature. This is Arian bishops, Arian missionaries going out and converting, particularly the barbarians. Right? So, there's a variety of efforts to try and evangelize the barbarians. Some of this missionary work was supported by the empire, which meant that it was probably, at least partially, meant to control the barbarians. Yes, there's probably some goal of converting them and some concern for their spiritual welfare, but it's also possible that secondarily, maybe even primarily, depending on who you would have talked to, it's an effort to bring barbarians under Roman control. One of the primary individuals involved in this mission work from an early time point of the period we're looking at is a man named Ulfilas. The name means little wolf. He was born in 311 as a Goth, so there's kind of a returning to his own people aspect to this. His father was likely a Christian captive. His mother was a Goth. So that's primarily his background. At the age of 20, he was sent to Constantinople, and there he was influenced by Eusebius of Nicomedia. Eusebius of Nicomedia was one of the moderate Arians, and so Arianism here is very important in all of this. Probably, again, Ulfilas would have been a mild Arian. There's not a lot that seems to indicate he was extremely outspoken about his Arianism, but that's his background. In Constantinople, he learned the scriptures, learned to read Greek and Arian, and at the age of 30, he becomes bishop to the Goths. This kind of the title that's given to him, and that's kind of his response. He will work as a missionary for 40 years, and during that time he does face, at various points, persecution. Some of it appears to be due to some suspicions that he was working with Rome to control the Goths. So, there's these fears that, he's not just there as a mission of charity or something like that, but that he's a Roman, he's a Roman figure. Eventually, with the success he does have, he does move the mission, or the mission is moved into Roman territory, so there's some protection there from the Romans. But some of his converts will later go back to the Goths as missionaries. Ultimately, the Goths were kind of divided. The two different factions, one kind of supportive of Rome, one against Rome, and Ulfilas kind of throws his lot in with the faction that is open to Roman help. Eventually, they will succeed, and their leader, the faction that is seeking Roman help, will succeed. Their leader decides they should follow the religion of the Roman emperor, who is the Emperor Valens at that time, which was Arian. Ulfilas is especially important, not just for his mission work, but especially because he creates an alphabet for the Gothic language. It was not a written language, but a spoken one, so he creates an alphabet in order to translate the Bible into it. So he translates the Bible into Gothic. In his translation, the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings aren't included. Now, there's kind of two different theories as to why they aren't included. Some say it was because of the focus in those books on just war. Right? There's so much effort on emphasis on war and violent conflict, and so Ulfilas, believing that the Goths already were violent and warlike enough, didn't need more of that, and so he decides not to include it. So that's a possibility. Of course, the book of Joshua has a lot of similar types of things, but that's included. So I don't know if that one, if that completely holds water. Another suggestion is that they're not there because he died before completing the translations, and maybe those were some of the last books that he waited to translate because of the names and some other things in Kings. Again, we can't be sure what the reason is, but this is a very important step, and one that is an important step in a lot of mission work from this time on. When people go to groups that don't have a written language, and there are no Bible translations. You have to create an alphabet to create writing, but then you also have to, get the indigenous peoples to accept that alphabet so that they can learn the alphabet to read the book that you are trying to translate in their language. But Ulfilas appears to be one of the first missionaries to engage in that process. Also important in this time period is the work of monks in mission work. We often think of monks as kind of holed up in their monasteries, separate from the world, and there's part of that. But many also acted as missionaries, at least for part of the time, where they would spend part of a year engaged in mission work. Much of the missionary work of monks during this time was preaching, so they would go around places preaching, and then other parts of their time would be spent in monasteries studying, meditating, praying. Martin of Tours, who we mentioned earlier, is one of those people. Martin, of course, is a bishop as well, but he does travel as a missionary, preaching throughout Gaul. And also here, too, we see another activity that starts to become a standard, that where there are pagan shrines, Martin would replace those with monasteries and churches. So you take kind of these holy spaces and you Christianize them. And so they were to these pagan gods, but now you kind of assert your power, assert your authority, and take over them and make them Christian holy places. So some mission work was focused on the barbarians. Other mission work during this time was focused on Great Britain and Ireland. Now, we mentioned in a previous session that there was a presence in Rome, or a Roman presence in Great Britain in the early centuries after Christ. But Hadrian's Wall is built to separate what was under Roman control from what was under the control of the Picts and the Scots. But a lot of the Christians that were there were, Roman Christians, and so a lot of the focus was just among Romans and soldiers, etc. There wasn't a lot of effort to try and convert others. The legions, however, were eventually withdrawn because of troubles on the continent, right, the European continent, and so that led to Romans, the soldiers, of course, going, and the Romans going there as well. The remaining ones who were there ended up being conquered by the Angles and the Saxons, which were pagan groups. But again, there is some indication of Christians in Britain by the end of the 2nd century. They're definitely there by the 4th. Several of the 4th century councils have British bishops. So, there are Britons in Christianity at the very latest by the 4th century. However, there's also an important effort to focus on during this time period, and that's the development of Celtic Christianity. So while the Germanic tribes are invading the Roman Empire, Celtic Christianity is flourishing, so much so that the Celts that are converted will end up sending missionaries to other countries, Scotland, for example. Additionally, one of the things that develops within Celtic Christianity that becomes important in other forms of Christianity is the confession of an individual, a private confession to a priest. Certainly confession had existed prior to this. It was an important part of Christianity, but the private confession to a priest is something that develops in Celtic Christianity in this early time period. There were some differences between the Scots-Irish Church and European Christianity at the time. The Celtic Christianity tended to be led by monastic leaders instead of bishops. There wasn't a strong bishop presence in Celtic Christianity, and also they differed with the Europeans over the dating of Easter. There were essentially three types of Christianity in these regions at the time. There was the Roman British form, right? So they have Roman Christianity, British Christianity, kind of integrating both of those. So there's that type. There's the Irish Christianity, which was established by Patrick, who we'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's this Iro-Scottish Christianity, a kind of amalgam of some things with Ireland and Scotland. There were some important characteristics of this Celtic Christianity that are important to note. It was monastic. A lot of the leaders, were monks and tended to encourage the development of monasteries. And monastic life in Ireland tended to be kind of distinctive. Many of them were anchorites. Many of them came from middle and upper classes, which was unlike other types of monks, where the monks came from the lower classes. Additionally, Celtic Christianity tended to connect with the clans. As I mentioned, the bishop was less important in this effort. Celtic Christianity was also very missionary. The idea was converting people and preparing them to go out and teach others. We mentioned, of course, the idea of penance, the importance of penance, new ideas coming in, as well as the idea of private penance developing within Celtic Christianity. There was much value in Irish society on education, even among the Druids. And so the Celtic Christianity tended to be more scholarly. And so many of these monasteries also had storehouses of Greek and Latin literary and philosophical classes, classics saved through the Middle Ages. That they preserved a lot of this older learning, and many of them monasteries had scriptoria, these places where books and manuscripts were copied. These monasteries in Ireland. And also, kind of integrated the illumination of manuscripts, where you would put decorations, kind of decorative text, borders, the pictures or illustrations, and so there was a lot of emphasis on more scholarly side here, but also, some aesthetics there as well. Very important in Celtic Christianity is Patrick, also referred to as Saint Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland. He was born to a Christian family in northwestern England, was the son of a deacon and the grandson of a presbyter, so a third-generation Christian. But at the age of 16, he was captured by pirates and sold into slavery, and specifically sold to Druid worshippers. There's not a ton of information that we can be absolutely certain of historically, because there are a lot of legends associated with Patrick, and we are talking about somebody from the late 300s, 400s. But what appears to be the case is that he's sold into slavery. He works herding pigs for a time, and there's also an autobiography that is apparently from Patrick. There's a question as to whether there are two Patricks, right? So there's all sorts of things, and I think Pearson gets into this a little bit, but we're not going to really get into that too much. So this autobiography from Patrick ultimately says, his captivity actually helped him to know God better. His life before, even though he's only 16, his life before didn't really, God's not that particularly close. He doesn't really understand God, even though he grows up in a Christian household. Eventually, Patrick would escape his situation and would make it to Gaul in Europe, where he would encounter monasticism, be a monk for a time, and then also become a priest. And at a certain point in his life, after being a priest for a while, he has an experience like Paul's Macedonian call, where he sees this vision of an Irishman appealing for Patrick to come back. And so he returns to Ireland as a missionary, with his efforts being focused on converting the pagans. Now, not surprisingly, he faces a lot of opposition from the Druids and the Druid leaders because of what he's wanting to convince the people of. And so he focuses on converting the Druid leaders, where the idea is if we convert the leaders, the people will follow. Now, there are certain questions, there are certain theories that there may have been some compromises, right? Patrick may have been open to compromising over some issues, particularly like magic, and so that's affects a lot of Celtic Christianity. On the other hand, Patrick evangelizes much of Ireland very successfully. There's some estimates as high as 100,000 people evangelized by his work. And again, he was of this mindset of, after conversion, he would encourage people to study the scriptures in order to turn them into missionaries as well. And through that, monasteries, of course, were very important. The focus of the monasteries that Patrick starts is to train converts for ministry, and so that, of course, makes monastic life very important in Ireland. Also very important in the development of Celtic Christianity is Augustine of Canterbury, who is sent by Pope Gregory, along with 40 other monks, to England. England is kind of divided into 7 kingdoms at this time. Right? We're talking about the 300s, 400s. So you have Celtic Christianity there. It's spreading into Great Britain or the England. And so Augustine has 2 goals. One is to convert the pagans to Christianity. The other is to bring this Celtic Christianity in line with the Roman Christianity. And so he will convert the King of Kent, who is married to the daughter of a Frankish king, so there's some political things there as well, and will encourage the destruction of anything he believes to be inconsistent with Roman Christianity. The Pope's kind of given him this mission. Destroy things that are inconsistent, take over or adapt what can be used. Right? So take over what you can, adapt what you can, but make sure there's other things that you get rid of, that people stop practicing. Ultimately, though, Augustine is not successful in winning over the Celts. They like their version of Christianity. And really, paganism after his death undoes a lot of his work. So that's missions to Great Britain and Ireland, but let's think about the missions from Great Britain and Ireland to the continent, to Europe. So in the 6th and 7th centuries, you see this kind of reversal, where instead of sending missions to the British Isles, they're being sent from the British Isles. And they travel to a variety of places where they once had been Christian. These are areas that once had been Christian, but it had declined, or these were places where paganism held sway. And so, the idea is reconquer them or conquer them the first time, convert them. And so here are these monks coming from the British Isles. They see themselves as going into voluntary exile for Christ. But as they do so, they're going into places that do have bishops over them. Right? There's been a decline in Christianity, paganism holds sway, but there are European bishops there. And so this leads to conflict because a lot of the missionaries that are coming are very independent. And remember, Celtic Christianity, the bishops aren't that important. And so, they're not really attendant to what the bishops want. They are more focused on what they're coming to do. And what they're coming to do is to try and bring Gaul back to Christianity, feeling that it had gotten too pagan. They're going to reorganize the church, particularly among this Celtic model. And then also, evangelize the pagans outside the Roman Empire. So they have a couple different things that are going to affect outsiders as well as insiders. And as they do, they kind of think about, the way to set this up and organize the church is to set up these self-sufficient monastic communities in these regions. Places where, all right, you clear the land off, plant some crops, construct buildings. They think of themselves as, we're going to be permanent residents. We're leaving Great Britain. We're coming here. We're going to use the monastery as a home base, and we're going to spread out from there. Now, the paganism at the time is very polytheistic. You got elves, you got spirits, you got departed souls, you got witches, you got demons. Paganism is very fearful. The gods are angry, and so the goal is pacify the gods through your rituals. Paganism also had very little emphasis on morality. It's very this-worldly, and it's also very communal. Right? The success of the tribe or clan is connected to religious rituals. So in trying to convert the pagans, these Celtic missionaries did a couple different things. The focus was on communal teaching. Very rarely did the monks want to do any sort of private teaching, except if it was with a king or another leader they thought would influence other people. Right? And so if they thought, all right, if we convert this person, it's going to lead to the conversion of this greater group. Right? We'll privately meet with them. Otherwise, we're just going to communally talk to people. We're not just going to go up to people one-on-one on the street and say, let's have a Bible study. They tried to do it in the pagans' languages. So instead of trying to do it in some sort of language, either their own or Latin or something else, you try to do it as much as possible in the pagan languages so that the pagans it's easier to understand instead of having them learn another language first and then learn about Christianity. A lot of the focus in this teaching was on basic teachings. Just some things about the universe, humanity, sin, the flood, Christ is the Redeemer. And these are the things they started off with. Furthermore, of course, they emphasize the superiority of the Christian God in context to the pagan deities and spirit beings. God was over and better than those. And much like the paganism of the time, the missions to the pagans tended to be rather this worldly. Ultimately, they emphasized things like the Christians being better off financially or prosperous than the pagans were. Now, again, whether they are able to necessarily suggest that was because of Christianity or because they were, connected with the Roman Empire is unclear. But that was, the idea. You're focused on how you're doing in this life. Well, look here, people who are Christian are doing better than what you are doing. So, who really has the blessing of, the divine beings? So that's mission work to the continent, mission work to the barbarians, mission work to British Isles. Last section to focus on at this time is mission work in the East. Now, what I mean here now is not the Eastern Roman Empire, but that part moving out. So as we're thinking about India, China, the Far East. During this time, a lot of mission work in the East was affected by the teachings and some things that happened with Nestorius. Nestorius was Patriarch of Constantinople and was very against heresy, and so he was very active against heresy, but he gets caught up in his own issue of heresy. Particularly, he gets caught up in a discussion over Mary and whether Mary was the mother of God or the bearer of Christ. So some people had begun calling Mary Theotokos, which means God-bearer, and appealing to people because of the idea of the divinity of Christ, and so to deny that Mary was the bearer of God is to deny that Jesus was God. Well, people that were opposed to this, of course, said, well, God can't have a mother. Right? How does God, who has no beginning or end, have a mother? And to suggest Mary is like this, that Mary is the mother of God, would suggest that Mary's essentially a goddess, and that elevates Mary too much. And Nestorius and others said, well, she should be called Christotokos, Christ-bearer, to kind of, avoid the issue of divinity and Mary. Well, others said, no, this separates the two natures. It separates the natures of Christ. And so a lot of this is also this question of, does Jesus have one nature or two natures, his human nature and his divine nature? And so, to say that Mary bears a human being who is the vehicle of divinity, other people said, okay, yes, no deity could be carried for 9 months, but, there's something less here, or you're suggesting there's a division in Christ, at which Nestorius essentially was. That Jesus is made up of two natures and is essentially two persons. The divine nature, the divine person in Jesus come from God. The human nature and the human person come from Mary. And so, this is suggesting, a dividing of Christ to opponents of this view. Right? And so, there's concern here about what he's teaching, but Nestorius is saying, we're kind of mixing these things, and they need to be distinct and not confused. Christ is both a single person and a twofold person. Right? So you have all these debates. What's the nature of Christ? And ultimately, at the Council of Ephesus, the council decides that Nestorius' view is heretical. And Nestorius was removed from being the Patriarch of Constantinople and excommunicated. Now, he doesn't really get the chance to defend himself. There's questions as to whether his views are fairly presented. People that were supporters of Nestorius didn't make it in time to the council because they were delayed. So the council is largely, stacked against Nestorius. Ultimately, his view is condemned, even though there's a question as to what did he really believe, what was he accused of believing. And a lot of people that did support him abandoned him, but not everyone. And so he does continue to have a following that becomes very active in mission work. And so he moves from Constantinople into Syria and connects with Syrian Christianity. Now, Syrian Christianity we can sometimes refer to as the Church of the East. This is different than the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. This is more that Syrian, Edessa type of Christianity that develops Syriac, uses Syriac, and some other things related to that. So it's a slightly different form of Christianity than strictly Orthodox, especially after Nestorius gets involved. Now, the Church of the East, of course, has been active since the 2nd century, 3rd century. We talked about their mission work in another session. But essentially, the Church in the East, the Church of the East, becomes Nestorian. And they kind of feel like Nestorius was poorly treated, and kind of side with him and take on some of his views. Now, supporters, of course, of Nestorius are having to flee. They're in exile. They're excommunicated by the Orthodox Church, and so they're spreading to Persia and other places. Yes, there is a question as to how Nestorian this church is, even though it's often referred to as Nestorian church. They do seem to adopt the doctrine of the two natures, but it's not something that's overly stressed. They are supporters of the Nicene Creed, etc. But to others, it looks like a heretical church. So often it's considered to be a heretical movement. But it becomes very active in missions in Central Asia, Persia, and even further east, India and China. Now, part of the reason for the success was the use of training schools, something that started in Edessa, where there is an emphasis on theological education, but then also an emphasis on the need to do missionary work like Peter and Paul. And so the students at these schools are expected to not only live disciplined lives to learn and study the scriptures, they're expected to then give their lives as missionaries. And some of that, too, often involved the monastic life. Remember, the monastic life does develop in the East, and so that is a part there as well. And so a lot of the Nestorian literature called for an ascetic lifestyle that encouraged evangelism. Eventually, Nestorians make it to China by the 7th century, 635 appears to be the date that Nestorians begin to operate in China. There's a new emperor in China at the time. Previous emperors had been very hostile to foreigners, but this emperor is open to outsiders coming in and believed that what he called the new religion of Christianity was worth investigating. Now, new religion in comparison to Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism, which had been around for several hundred, if not 1,000 years, by this time, Christianity's new. Even though Christianity's been around for 6 centuries at this point, it's new to the Chinese. And it's possible that the emphasis on education that was a part of Nestorianism is what makes this appealing to the Chinese leaders, the emperor, other individuals as well. So the Nestorians do what they frequently do, establish monasteries, translate the scriptures. They do engage in some contextualization. They engage in hybridity. They compare Jesus and Confucius on the one hand, right? That doesn't seem too bad, but on the other hand, they use a lot of Buddhist or Taoist ideas to communicate the gospel, like calling God Buddha, right? And saying that God is Buddha, recognizing the divinity of the emperor. And so that's more problematic. They are, however, successful in China, but a lot of that success is undone when later emperors in a couple hundred years are more committed to upholding Chinese traditions, particularly Taoism and Confucianism, and they're suspicious of foreigners and foreign religions. Buddhists face the same thing because Buddhism starts in India. So both Buddhism and Christianity, their monasteries are destroyed, people are kicked out of China, and by the end of the 10th century, the Christian influence in China is essentially gone. There probably still were Christians in China, but not in any significant numbers that we know about or that had any sort of significant influence. That brings this session to a close, focusing on that early medieval period, about 400 to about 800. And the next session we'll look at the period of 800 to 1200, thinking through some of the missionary efforts, what was the culture at the time, etc. One area we won't spend much time talking about in that next session is Islam, which develops during this time period we're talking about now and the next. But we're going to save that for some separate discussion about the development of Islam, the connections between Islam and Christianity, and of course out of that, the Crusades. And so that's what's coming up in the next couple of sessions.